We're really delighted today to present a really important and interesting session on getting bought by Google, or another technology heavyweight by Miller Thomson. Anthony Fazekas, I knew I'd blow it, from Miller Thomson, and Daniel Servos from Locationary. So we had to start a little bit later because we have people that sort of show up after the time and wanted to minimize the noise on the video. So my apologies for starting late. I just wanted to do a quick introduction of our speakers before we give them the floor. Anthony is a partner at Miller Thomson LLP. He practices in all areas of information technology law, including such tasks as drafting original patents for IT companies, handling all aspects of high-profile inbound and outbound technology licensing transactions, and developing cutting-edge legal templates for technology companies in all areas. He also works to advise IT companies and research organizations on how to maximize the impact of their R&D activity. Mr. Fazekas, still blew it, has spoken at numerous conferences on intellectual property law and information technology law, and has been very involved with MaRS on numerous levels over the past number of years. And our other speaker, Dan Servos, is currently the COO of Locationary. He's a serial entrepreneur, which is the best kind. We like those very much. Prior to working with Locationary, he was CEO of Social Deck, which was an early leader in mobile and social gaming that was acquired by Google, so he speaks from first-hand experience here today. He's also held senior roles at AOL and Bay Networks and serves on the board of several startups. So welcome, Anthony and Dan.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Maybe you're wondering a little bit, why is a lawyer talking about how to get acquired by Google? Well, the reason's quite simple. We've been selling a lot of clients from our early stage company program called MTech to companies such as Google, Intel, RIM, and the list goes on. We also act for large companies, and so we've been able to glean what it is that they're really looking for. Because lots of people from Google are going to go and talk about, perhaps how they value company or value companies, trends. Lots of people talk about valuation in the abstract, but of course it's very different when you look at it on a case study basis. That's why when MaRS asked me, well, would you like to talk about intellectual property? I said, well, I think it would be more interesting actually to talk about getting bought by Google or a large company, because MaRS, the ecosystem, of course, is about fostering and nurturing startup companies and helping them scale. And of course, everybody's going to be successful if we can have more and more and larger exits. So I'm very excited that Dan is going to be joining me soon up here to talk about his real life experience. And what I'm going to be sharing mostly is what we were able to glean through the IP due diligences that we're involved in, what the business people at these large companies say when they're talking about valuation around the table, the arguments that go back and forth, and out of that, of course, best practices for building a business that is as valuable as possible. So the introduction is going to be, of course, it's going to set out what we're going to talk about. I'm going to speak a little bit at the end if we have time, but I hope I don't have time to talk too much about IP in detail, because what I'm hoping is that this is going to be a very interactive session. The recording by MaRS, the folks may not necessarily like that, because I understand there's some technical difficulties when that happens, but I think it would be really interesting once we hear what Dan has to say and get his perspective, to have your perspectives as well. How can MaRS as an ecosystem build more exits like Radian 6, for example, which was sold for a very large amount, because there are companies that we've acted for, we really thought they would get there, but perhaps they sold early, or perhaps there were other issues, but we'll deal with that. But we're very interested in your perspective as well on this very important topic. We're going to try to make it a little bit interactive. So Dan, after I finish this brief introduction, is going to talk a bit about Locationary and their exciting new platform called Saturn. And also, we're going to engage in a bit of a question and answer session about how to build valuable companies and what large companies like Google is looking for. But I'd really like you guys to feel free to raise your hand, make comments, ask questions throughout. So without any further ado, Dan, do you want to talk a little bit about Locationary?
Thanks, Anthony.
Here you go.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Servos, and let me ask, before I even get started, is there anybody here from Google? Come on, you have to tell the truth.
Or in the other room.
Yeah. Anybody from the other room, like, come out right now. Obviously, I have to be really careful what I say, but I'll try to give you as much insight as I can. But before we get into a bit of Q&A about what it's like to be bought by companies like Google, I thought you might be interested in understanding a little bit about, like, who is Locationary and what are we all about, just to give you a little context about what I'm focused on right now. And we can talk about how, in the context of Locationary, what we're doing from a strategic perspective to be prepared for ultimately, hopefully, an exit of some sort. So Locationary is a platform that was developed to be able to gather data from around the world, specifically about local businesses, so location-based local business information. It is one of the biggest opportunities and challenges in the location-based industry today for mobile, largely because local business data changes so often and it's so inaccurate. And therefore, we've all experienced the problem of using various mobile apps, navigation or otherwise, only to find that the place you thought you were going to is no longer there. It was closed, it's moved. It was just the wrong address, the wrong lat long. I mean, the problems are endless. But even on the more positive side, information that you want about that local business from a proximity perspective as you're traveling around, you would like to know a lot more about the businesses and the types of things that you're looking to buy as fast as you can get it that's relevant to you, your needs, and basically your preferences. So the whole world of location-based data is, a continually massively growing market opportunity. And so we built a platform that basically helps us to not only gather that data, but also help big publishers manage that data. And so the platform that we created to do this is called Saturn. Saturn is an end-to-end platform that basically does a number of things. It helps from it is a cloud-based service. It helps from a private data storage perspective, so any publisher can actually, like Dropbox, create their own repositories in the cloud. They can bring in all their multiple data feeds, and most publishers get anywhere from 10 to literally hundreds of different data feeds of different types of location-based data that they bring into their own organizations. They then go through a horrendous exercise to actually try and basically dedupe, normalize, clean that data, and create some basically valued composite that then gets pushed back out into content for consumption based on either web or mobile applications. It is a huge problem for them, and largely because they all grew up in this world doing it from a batch perspective. And so the concept of real-time online data ingestion, merging, deduping, normalization, and then broadcasting out is, in a real-time kind of Web 2.0 world, is really not something that most of these publishers have kept up with. And so basically Saturn provides that capability on the front end. Then once the data is actually in Saturn, they have an additional benefit opportunity as a publisher or a participant to be able to look at all the other types of feeds that have been made public in Saturn. So they can go through a library of different types of data sources and say, I want to subscribe to the following 3 feeds. It could be a feed of all the Marriott chain hotel restaurants. So it could be a feed of all the specific Walmart locations and specific data that Walmart's publishing data-wise from each of those local Walmart stores. So any type of data feed that exists that the owner of that data feed decided to make public to allow others to come subscribe to it, any user or participant in Saturn can actually subscribe as well. And once they're accepted as a subscriber to that data, it now becomes another data source in their own private repository that they can then, again, go back and use the tools that we enable them to merge, dedupe, and normalize that data into their common composite. And so that's what we call integrate and subscribe. And then from a distribution standpoint, as I said, Saturn is also for broadcasting and pushing the data out on a real-time basis. That requires the publisher to have APIs or feeds that allow them to take that data on a real-time basis. More and more publishers are getting to that point, which is a good thing. And they're very reluctant to take anyone's data in that manner to do a real-time update from a publishing content perspective. But the more that data is authenticated as authorized from the business owner, the more the publishers are all willing to take a real-time feed to do updates. And of course, that's all part of the value proposition of Saturn, is that the data that we're getting in from many of the clients, digital agencies that are working directly with local businesses, it's authorized official data, and that's why the publishers are willing to take it. And then last point, from a real-time perspective, any participant in Saturn and any number of data sources or repositories that are hooked to each other, once a local business makes one update in Saturn, it gets pushed out and updated to every other single user of that data. And so it has this very viral network effect of updating real-time simultaneously across Saturn and then pushed out across all the links to all the publishers. So that's kind of a very high level. I'm kind of glossing over a ton of details, but just to kind of give you the context as to what Saturn's all about to solve this problem of real-time, high-quality, location-based data about local businesses. And so that's the kind of quick introduction about Locationary. I could go into a lot more detail, but I think the net of it in the context of our discussion is, from day one, we've been at this now for about a year and a half. We've always thought about, how are we going to develop a system, a platform, and then a whole strategy around something that is going to not just solve a big problem and create real, value for our investors and for the employees of the company, but ultimately be well positioned so that, the various customers and publishers we're dealing with will be, and other data management companies will look at Saturn as an excellent value proposition of something that is a big hole in their portfolio of products and services that they need and want, and therefore approach us at some point to make us an offer to acquire us.
So just out of curiosity, using Saturn as an example, you must have gone through within Locationary assessment of the opportunity that it represented, that it wasn't just a very good opportunity, it was an amazing opportunity. So what kinds of thought processes, analyses did you go through with your team? Because that's partially what companies are struggling with a little bit within the ecosystem. There's some good companies and very good companies, but some are wondering whether they're truly great companies, especially when they have 4, 5, 6 different ideas, market avenues that they can pursue. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, is anyone here actually in a startup today? Okay, so you guys can all appreciate what I'm about to say. Like, you get started on one thesis. Usually there's a big idea person. There could be a couple. The founders of the company, and they have great vision and an idea about how to not just solve a problem, but go after a big open space that, or an existing space that is still looking for new ways to exploit an opportunity. And so you go down that path. And we went down that path. We started down the path of crowdsourcing data. So we built Locationary 1.0 was a platform that we built that would, in a more sophisticated manner, attract what we call global editors around the world, people like us in our local communities who care about the local data in your community being accurate, and entice them and reward them with, with prizes, with cash prizes, to basically correct data. So to help us fill out profiles of information about local businesses in literally hundreds of countries around the world, with very accurate, deep, contextual data about that local business. And that was Locationary 1.0. It's a whole platform, completely developed with the whole banking infrastructure and everything required to do not just the monitoring and measuring of the quality of the data coming in, but then the rewards going out using gamification. So, it's a very sophisticated system. That was an important start, and we all believed that that was, the goal. But as you get further down the path, you realize, wow, that was a pretty good goal. Okay, we achieved that. We validated it. We started collecting data and selling it to all sorts of big companies. But there's a bigger piece here this is becoming more of a piece to the puzzle, not the puzzle solution. And you start to realize that there are other opportunities around the collection of that kind of data. Through going out and asking questions and meeting with potential customers, you start to understand more about a bigger problem that they need you to solve. And so some people like to call it pivoting. I like to call it we learn a lot more about the market and the participants and we continue to evolve, our platform and solution to something that we think is even bigger. And that's what happened. We started to realize it's the whole front end of just the process of dealing with data and data management. And then it's the whole other side of being able to then do the proper broadcasting in a real-time nature of this data. Those two big pieces were missing in the market, and so we took what we had developed initially and we completely developed another platform on top of it to solve a bigger problem.
And what about the critical issue of business model? Because there's some businesses where the business model is fairly obvious, and there are other really strong startups where the business model is less obvious. And sometimes people choose one model, realize it doesn't work, switch to another one. Meanwhile, there's competition, so it can be a really important decision-making process. You have any suggestions for people in the MaRS ecosystem on that issue of how to pick the right business model?
I don't know if it's possible to actually pick the right business model up front. I'd love to meet someone that actually has. I think you pick a model that you feel is the most appropriate for the product or service that you've developed, and then you go at it, and as you're negotiating deals and starting to really understand kind of the cost pricing, and the analysis of the costs that are going in to deliver, and therefore the margin that you're bringing to the company, and the competitiveness of the pricing, and all the other factors that you have to look at, you again, iterate, and you start to realize, okay, either the basic model was correct, but we need to tweak some of the variables around how to effectively price it, or you realize that that model itself is probably not the ideal model, and you move to another one. And so, I'm on to probably my fifth model, frankly, but every one we just got better in terms of nailing that mix of competitiveness, value-based pricing, margin, and therefore better understanding of how to control our costs.
So your startup is starting to get traction. Things are going quite well. How do you know when it's time to start thinking that you're ready for an exit?
Again, I go into this, and I've been through a number of exits. I guess this is my fourth startup, and the first three were all successful exits. The first one was probably the largest success. It was a company called Quack.com. Back in 2001, we were acquired by AOL for a lot of money, and it was nuts. It was crazy. We never saw it coming, and it was pre the bubble burst, right? So we were like damn lucky in every sense of the word, and luck, but again, it's not something that we were looking for. It just one day, a specific executive who happened to be Ted Leonsis, who for those of you who know who Ted is, he owns the Washington Capitals, but he decided that it was extremely important to AOL at that time strategically to be able to get his email no matter where he was, even if he was just driving, and he wanted someone to be able to read it to him, and he didn't want it to be his assistant. And so he found us, his people found us, and they decided that they had to have our technology, which was we were a voice portal to the internet, basically using voice recognition and text-to-speech. So, it was very serendipitous that that specific executive at that time had that need and decided that that's where he wanted to take some of the new strategy with AOL. So, and then fast forward, the second exit was more of a merger of a company called NeoEdge, which was a casual game video ad network and casual game business. And that one, I'd say, we started to get to the point where we had a good run rate. We were at a $4 million run rate. We had a great list of customers, both on the publisher, on the inventory side, and on the demand side with brands and advertisers. But we were getting to that inflection point in a business cycle where we either had to do a real massive raise to really get, because it becomes such a sales driven, business in that specific market. So you either had to do a massive raise to be able to have enough cash to start hiring a lot more salespeople around the country, or you merged. And so we decided, because we had a couple of interested parties that wanted some traction in the social game space, to merge. A casual game-based video ad network company with a social game company. But that's different. It's a life cycle thing. You get to that point where you start looking at options that, you know, door A or door B and what the, you know, ramifications are. Whereas Social Deck with Google, I mean, two very bright guys from University of Waterloo, Anisha Cherry and Jason Patel, were the founders of this social mobile game network and platform that basically bridged, you know, the issues around playing games across multiple platforms. You know, it was fragmentation, you know, a fragmentation solution, and you know, they had struggled for quite a while, but had some good success with Shake and Spell, which was one of the best selling games at that time. I think that we got to over 1 million downloads. You know, but they were struggling with how to get out of kind of the real bootstrap startup mode. They had some minimal cash injection from BlackBerry Partners Fund, but they really needed to take it to the next level. And through a couple of, you know, associates, I happened to have just been coming off my last gig, met them, and we got to know each other, started helping them out, and then they asked me to become the CEO. And so in that case, again, very serendipitous. It's not something we were looking for. We built a plan. We started, you know, going to market with a whole bunch of partners and publishers. We started to raise more money. We were about to raise even more money, and then along came a couple of interested parties to acquire us. Ones that we started talking to about doing a commercial deal with us. Mm. And before I knew it, we got into a bidding war between two companies. Google was one, obviously, and the other one I'm not sure I'm allowed to say, but it was a huge game company that recently went public. And you know, before we knew it, we were in the middle of literally a bidding war, you know, for this platform and for the team. And so I think it was a timing thing, right? It was like, you know, it just so happened that both companies really wanted high quality, high caliber, you know, mobile engineering talent that really understood all three platforms. They wanted an existing IP set of technology that they could, you know, take and obviously mold, but to get, you know, hit the ground running. They didn't want to like start all over. Mm-hmm. And we were a little bit vulnerable from a perspective of we were in the market of trying to raise money. And so when you have two founders that, you know, had been, you know, beating their brains out for 2 years to try to get to a certain, you know, inflection point, which just started to happen, and then you have two big monolithic corporations offering you a lot of money, it kind of becomes a simple decision. And my advice for the guys was, look, take the money. Mm. Take the money, you know, build a little more wealth for yourselves in what follows in the company that you go to, whichever one we choose, and, you know, build more experience working within those corporations. It won't be forever. It might be for 2-3 years, depending on how long they lock you up, and then come back. Like, you're young, pay off your debts, you know, enjoy life a little bit. You've been working extremely hard, and then come back and do it all again. And that's what we ended up doing.
And for somebody who has a startup where Google and Microsoft and others aren't necessarily coming knocking on their door, but they have a really good company, it's got traction, it's scaling really nicely, and an exit is something they want to seriously consider, what strategies do you think might work to try to create some of that interest? Would you hire an investment bank? Would you not? Would you try to contact the companies? Would you work through people in your network who perhaps work at these companies? What are some of the things that might work in your opinion?
Let me answer that, I guess, a couple of things you asked. So on the investment bank side, is there anyone here from an investment bank? Okay, good. Oh, sorry. So I can't really say what I wanted to say then. No, I'm kidding. I think there's a right time and a place for an investment bank to get involved. And the problem is, as soon as, if you're in a certain earlier stage, before you get like beyond Series B, and you have an investment bank involved, you're just putting up a flag like fire sale. Like that's gonna, it may not be true, that may not be actually the reason you're doing it, but then it comes across as a position of weakness. Like why are you guys even hit a Series B? Why are you hiring someone to help, you know, sell you? Now, there's all ways to do this properly with an investment bank, and you don't have to go out and say, you know, like, we're looking for an acquirer. You could go out and say the investment bank is helping you raise money, right? Which is probably the better way to do it. But even in that approach, I don't think it, again, based on stage of the company, it's always the right thing to do. In my experience, and I can only talk from my own experience, the better way to do that is is through network and through your network of relationships and people that you trust, your trusted network of people that are in positions within some of those corporations that know the right people in corp dev groups and that know your value and that can act as an advocate on your behalf without you actually having to be the one to say, hey, I'm interested in being acquired. Because you never actually want to be in that position to say that, because again, it comes from a position of weakness. But having a trusted advisor or your lawyer or a board member or just an investor or anyone, doesn't have to be any of those specific people. It could be someone that you have a good relationship with that can whisper into the ear of a corp dev person within a company either that you're already doing business with and they really like you and like what you're doing, which normally can take a natural path anyway, but if it isn't, it can get a little nudge, to take that path. Or if it's a corporation that you're not currently in partnership and doing business with, but again, you have a trusted source and a contact that can whisper, into the ear of corp dev and say, hey, that's a really hot company. They've got some great talent IP and they're on fire. Like, you should definitely take a look at it.
Yeah, I mean, from our transactions, I can say where we were selling or we were acting for the buyer of technology companies, I can say that 9 out of 10 of the acquisitions were either fed by the company finding the company on their own. So the Google or the Microsoft finding them on their own. They like to do that. They're watching everyone. If you're getting traction, odds are they know about you. Somebody just coming out of nowhere doesn't really happen in this day and age very often. It comes also from participating in organizations like MaRS, speaking at things. Certainly there's tons of people, I don't want to call them spies necessarily, but there's lots of people that are specifically attending things like startup competitions with the specific mandate to collect information on what people are up to and so on and so forth. And of course, the other really, really big thing is that these entire sort of alliance programs that are set up by large companies, their real design is to, of course, collaborate with smaller companies and have people build on their platforms, but it's also quite specifically to find targets. In fact, not everyone's going to publish what their policy is, but a lot of the companies that we've been working with, they have a very specific internal process that says, we acquire companies preferably only if they're an alliance partner. This is how long they have to be in there. These are the phases they have to go through. So really it starts with a partnership with these companies 9 times out of 10. Yeah,
I totally agree with you. And I think that, having... It's like you hear this over and over and over again that you have to constantly be networking, and the day you stop networking is the day basically it's a going out of business kind of strategy. And so if you're not networking, and really by that I mean truly working it. Like, if you're not as an entrepreneur spending at least an hour to an hour and a half a day, and that's just being on the phone, talking to people in your network and getting them to introduce you to at least 1 or 2 new people that you didn't know before, you're falling behind. And so, it gets easier. It gets so much easier the more you do it, and it's amazing the effect and result that it can have, from a network effect perspective.
There's a question on the floor.
Yes, so my question is, I guess, to both of you on this topic. Are there any specific challenges for Canadian companies looking to get acquired, particularly because they're based in Canada, they want to get acquired in the US or something along those lines?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a challenge for sure. Despite what everyone will probably tell you, it is a challenge. I think that. And again, it's kind of common sense. A lot of the big corporations, whether they're East Coast or West Coast, they want you close by. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, is anyone here actually American? Okay. A lot of Americans still don't really understand Canada. I mean, unless you live here, of course. And they kind of still view us as this foreign entity, economic, political, social infrastructure that they really don't understand. And so they'll never really want to, kind of admit that, but it makes them a little fearful of investing and or acquiring an asset, unless, of course, you're willing to move. And if you put up your hand right away, right from the very start of any discussion and say, we've got a team of 12 engineers and every one of us is absolutely comfortable with moving to California, that's different. I mean, then they would be very interested, I think, in most cases, because they see that as actually a lower cost way of acquiring talent. But if you want to stay in Canada, you want to stay in Toronto, and a lot of us do. We don't want to move. We love Canada. We love Toronto, or wherever you're from in Canada, and you want to stay, it's tougher. You have to find the right mix of acquirer who's willing to start to invest, unless they already have presence here. Many of them do, but many of them don't. If they don't have any presence here at all, they don't understand our tax laws and everything else, then it becomes a bit of a gamble on their part to convince them as to why they need to establish, a center of business here and get established as a Canadian, subsidiary of a larger corporation.
The flip side, I think, is that the talent pool is becoming very strong, not just in Toronto, but in other places as well. So it's easier, I think, to convince companies not only to set up locally, but even use it as almost like a bit of an initial bastion to build a bigger team locally. I think, for example, Cognivision is a good example of that, where Intel has a new division thanks to that acquisition locally. And you're hearing from companies more and more that they understand that talent pools are extremely important. While it's nice to have people locally, I think sometimes what that means is that the key business people might move for a time or commute back and forth, but you can't attract all of the developers that all these companies are going to need necessarily to the East and West Coast, because there's so much work to do, and talent is very, very rare sometimes. So I think it's improving. The flip side, though, is just speaking to these companies. When you talk about, well, what about Radian 6 and other large exits, they see those things as outliers. I don't think the message has necessarily gotten through yet that Canada has very, very strong ecosystems. They see those things as being almost aberrations. So that's why we have to grow more startups and make them bigger, to have 7 or 8 or 9 Radian 6s, because then perhaps those attitudes will start changing a little bit.
Yeah, I don't want to sound overly negative on my response. I mean, there's lots of great success stories. And more of the larger companies are investing here. And you see it every day, right? Now Zynga has bought 5 Mobile, right? That was the first for Zynga to establish a base here. Mm-hmm. So once they get over that little first hump, that we're gonna do this, we're gonna establish a presence in Canada legally and business and actual business resource investment, then I think it gets easier. But it's that first one, so it really depends on which companies from your ecosystem you're working with, and if they already have presence here, then I'd say it's a lot easier. If they don't, then it's a lot.
Well, even tracking the presence of Google in Canada, that's very much the way it went, because they acquired Rick Wireless first, which is one of our clients in Waterloo, and then there were rumors that there was going to be a large business unit establishing itself. That didn't really come to fruition at all. But then they started to put their sales team here. They acquired Push Life, realized that there was good development talent. So one thing does lead to another. But Google is going to be a big employer in Ontario, it seems, around 5 years, if what they say is true, and I think it probably is. So there are some positive aspects for sure. On that issue, who else do you think, sniffing around in Toronto based on what you've heard in your network? I mean, we've been talking about Google and Zynga, but there are others as well. Who comes to mind?
Facebook, for sure. I'm sure most of you have probably heard the rumors that they've been flirting with opening a shop in Waterloo, right across the street from Google.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure, I know some of the Facebook guys, and I'm not so sure that is really what they intend to do, or whether they're just doing it to piss off Google.
Yeah, it's possible.
I wouldn't put it by them that they put an offer in on a lease just to scare them. But I think ultimately they will establish a base here, and they have looked at a number of companies. I don't know if have they actually made an acquisition in Canada?
No, not to my knowledge, not yet.
But I know they've looked at a number of companies. And certainly Amr, Varma, and Extreme are very close to Facebook, and have a number of their portfolio companies, are of great interest there. So I think it's inevitable that Facebook will start buying here. It's just, I think, a question of time. I know Amazon, is always on the lookout.
Cisco.
Yeah.
As well.
And Cisco, eBay, I'm just thinking of the larger companies. There's a lot smaller mid-cap and small-cap public companies that are always looking around too. But of course, Salesforce.com is another one that comes to mind. Those are a few that I know have corp dev guys actually looking at various companies in the area.
Now, let's say there's some strong interest shown by a Google or a Zynga or whomever. What do you do to get your company ready? What do you absolutely need to do almost immediately?
Yeah. You know, one of the challenges, of course, being in a startup is making sure you have all your ducks in a row and your books in order, and it's never easy to keep all that kind of up to date and current and accurate, and having every single document scanned, filed, and properly available on demand at a moment's notice. But the reality is you really do need to work at that and make sure that you're well prepared, because the minute you start to get into once you get past the LOI process, and of course the LOI is the beginning of everything. So you know, usually the typical process is first you get an LOI. It's typically binding from the perspective that you know, you have to be very careful about disclosure issues after you sign a binding LOI, and both companies are entering into agreement to actually go through a process. But once that process begins, the demands for documentation from a diligence perspective will be significant, and you have to be ready to respond and have, you know, things well taken care of. Like, you know, all your employment agreements have to be pretty tight and well done, and that's why you have to make sure you've got a good lawyer who's helped you ensure that all those employment agreements are really tight, that all your, you know, non-disclosure and proprietary invention and information agreements are all very tight, because that will be a big issue for a lot of acquirers if you don't have all that in place. And that's just on the employee side of the asset perspective. Then if you have patents or you have patent filings, you have to have, you know, all that documentation really well covered. Again, another good reason to have a really good lawyer, to make sure that is all there and ready to basically go through diligence. And then, of course, documentation on your IP, like on your platform, your technology, your services. You have to have, you know, you have to be ready to basically allow a team of technologists from the acquirer to come in and start to take a look at exactly what you have. And typically what they'll want to do before they actually physically start to do that is they're going to want to read through documentation about your technology. And so you have to have all that pretty well current and up to date. How's that for starters?
No, yeah, that's really good. I mean, I think that's a good list. And I think what's important to understand is that every single company has their own specific process. It may depend on their lawyer, legal team that's on a special deal, the likes and dislikes. So you can't predict what they're going to ask in what order, but certainly whatever they do ask for, you have to get back to them right away. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is that all these things, to have your T's crossed and your I's dotted, costs a lot of money. So there's an ability to, in a sense, defer things to a point. The problem is that sometimes what hampers us in getting things done in a huge flurry of activity quickly and relatively efficiently is that the company isn't organized internally, which is quite problematic. So there's certain things that you can completely do on your own if you try to figure out what best practices would be, or just basic record keeping, thinking through, okay, do we have agreements for everyone? Do we know that this is a good one? Can I ask for a better template? There's a lot of time involved in that, but often we find that startups are really busy building the technology and getting into market and so on, and this is sort of this realm of activity that's the last thing you want to do. And perhaps we're all the same, and it's human nature. It's just like, you know, keeping track of your receipts and so on and so forth. But when the company comes in, they're going to have really specific questions. It also surprises me in these transactions because I figure, okay, I'm used to the legal stuff needing to be cleaned up a little bit, but sometimes people trip on the technical due diligence as well. So there's more and more this tendency to sort of develop with not a lot of documentation, which is probably okay and understandable as long as you have a lot of homework that's been done beforehand, nonetheless, to put at least in a high-level explanation of, you know, your overall platform, what the pieces are. You know, you don't have detailed documentation, but still almost like a ledger of the different key modules and components and how they relate to one another, or basic architecture diagrams. you have to think of the fact that the technical team is going to come in, and often in these transactions they're multidisciplinary. 5, 6 of them come at once. They want to meet the whole team. They're asking questions left, right, and center. They're not going to give you a list of things what they're looking for in advance. Normally they just land on your doorstep, and you really, really have to prepare for it and just try to anticipate every single thing that they'll want to see and look for. People are okay with open source, they understand, but you have to, again, be organized. If you say, I have all these open source things, but I never looked at the open source license, I don't have a copy of it, that's not a very good thing. But that's not a huge legal analysis that's required to figure that out. It's just another important housekeeping item.
Can I just add a few points?
Sure.
I've actually built and sold a company through multiple rounds of financing, and I sold a company to VMware. I just want to really emphasize this being prepared aspect, and it's not really about just the final sale, it's about even financing. When we got funding from Benchmark, we were a company that was spread across the world with 6 different companies in different countries. It was apparently the worst or the longest due diligence Benchmark has ever done, and part of it was that, you know, our North American company, which I was running, was financially was okay, the books were okay, but in other places it was anywhere from you know, to kind of okay to a disaster, and it all gets sorted out. But it took 6 weeks of a lot of pain, and you know the whole deal could have fallen through. So it pays back over and over and over again to have all your ducks in order. Make sure your accounting is up to date. Make sure your corporate structure is up to date. You're going to pay way more later. You know, I think the legal bills on some of these acquisitions can easily run a couple $100,000. So spend the time and the money up front. It's a lot cheaper up front. You talked about the licensing. I really want to emphasize that actually you have to have a lot of care around using open source licenses. Like it can be a total deal breaker if you're using some open source libraries that, you know, IBM, for example, is not going to touch anything that's using LGPL license. And so you have to very carefully look at open source is great. Our company was based on open source, but make sure you know what you're using and why you're using it and where you're using. You're gonna have to you're gonna get a spreadsheet with every single source file in your product, and you have to go there and actually say, you know, what's the license for that? What is it used? I mean, it's an unbelievable process to go through this due diligence where you're basically sitting up days on end, 24 hours a day, almost going through this due diligence. The more you can do up front, the better. It's hugely important.
It's a really good point. I'll just jump in from one other thought was, it not only becomes very much a risk issue to the deal from a, like, have you got everything that you need? Because if you don't, it could raise a serious enough or material enough risk that they decide to walk from the deal. Because this is too much of a liability they're inheriting. But so that I totally agree with that. But the other thing is, and again, as an entrepreneur, the reality is you can't afford a long due diligence cycle. You just can't. While you're going through and spending so much energy trying to get through this process, you have a business to run, and you cannot, you know, let yourself for a moment take your eye off the ball. The reality is the deal may not close. So you really have to now double down and work just as hard to continue to keep your business going forward and be really positive and have all the positive energy that the deal is going to close, but the deal may not close. And so the faster you can, you know, shorten, and the more you can shorten that whole due diligence process because you're well prepared, the less risk to you as an entrepreneur in that you'll survive coming out the other end. Like, I'm not trying to sound overly negative, but that is the reality.
Well, and then the large companies, they're buying teams of people ultimately most of the time, and sometimes they're also buying intellectual property and some other things. But really, when we've seen this in transactions as well, if the due diligence is going sour in a way in different domains that are important to the company, it does have an impact on their view of the team. Because if this is the way they keep their books or this is the way they do this, then they're not going to be able to manage this team, et cetera. And that also, it does back into valuation, and we've seen that a number of times where, you know, the due diligence comes back. Initially, of course, the valuation that the company had in mind hasn't been shared with the startup yet, but they had a range that they were thinking of, and the company says, you know, we're taking it down to this range for the following reasons, and it has to do with a lot of these things, and it may seem, you know, nitpicky and so on, but I think in a way, the companies that have these things in order, They tend to integrate better. They tend to respond to sort of requirements of the acquirer in different domains better. So it's a real management prerogative that's out there. The other thing that's important to understand practically is that these companies track their own expenses related to due diligence. And so in their mind, you know, they have to manage their budgets as well, legal and technical due diligence and so on. So they actually use Serengeti and other pretty sophisticated systems to track expenses. And once they reach certain thresholds and they're not past certain due diligence milestones, they often throw their hands up and say, this is a good indication that this is not going to be a good fit, and they move on. And the other thing that's important to note is that these companies usually are talking to multiple companies at one time, right? So they're looking for a startup, let's say in social gaming. They're not probably talking to one, they're probably talking to 2 or 3. So you are jockeying for position in a way. If you want a strong valuation, you want the transaction to happen, you want to be the one that seems the most organized, the best team, et cetera, on all of these criteria. And so often we've seen that as well, where, you know, target A gets dropped. Target B is continuing for some of these reasons. So it's important to keep that in mind.
Yep, couldn't agree more.
So any other things that you can think of that you can do perhaps to help argue for a bigger valuation? Because that's sort of a critical thing. And there's certain things I'm going to talk about a little bit later, IP and so on, but more from a business perspective, because there's a negotiation aspect, there's a selling aspect that's really important. Once the transaction seems to be happening, you want to get, of course, as much money as possible. Are there any sort of tricks or suggestions that you have for people?
Well, I wouldn't say I have any tricks, but you know, clearly, you know, again, from an entrepreneurial perspective, from a business operator, there's a number of things that we're always investing our time in and energy. And that is, A, making sure that we're always trying to hire the best talent. So especially, you know, when it comes to engineering, like everybody else, we're looking at all the top universities, you know, the top comp sci and math guys coming out of there, and we spend a lot of time focused on that. And even when we think we can't afford another really high talent Waterloo engineer, if one happens to come our way, we'll hire them. We'll find the money, because at the end of the day, we know that as we grow as a business, we're going to have more than enough for you know, engineers to do, and so we'll be able to make that engineer really productive. And then on the flip side, from an investment and return perspective, we know that engineer is going to be worth potentially $1 million, you know, in an acquisition valuation perspective. And then from a patent perspective, you know, we spend you know, it's one of our top priorities, and so we spend a lot of money, as you know, and a lot of time and effort filing, well, making sure, first of all, that we understand what is patentable, and no one knows that better than you, and in terms of figuring out what do we have technologically that is unique and different versus other things that may or may not be similar in the market. And then going through the process to actually, you know, file patent applications, because that may or may not have a direct bearing at the end of the day on your valuation, but it could be a big differential in why they want to acquire you versus someone else that may be similar to you.
Yeah.
And so that's important, and it's helped us a number of times, you know, significantly. You know, obviously being you know, from a times multiple kind of acquisition valuation model, you know, getting out of a kind of a pre-revenue stage, getting into a revenue model where you know, you're showing a traction and a velocity that you can project with some level of assurity based on the validation of what you've been able to do so far, that, you know, goes to a negotiation tactic in your valuation negotiation, because you know, you want to definitely get to a certain point where you have enough revenue and a pipeline, and you know, and this all has to be also very well documented, with validation points, you know, of what you've been able to do so far relating back to your pipeline, so that you can show with a level of confidence that you're going to hit, you know, a certain curve over a period of 1 to 2 years, and with or without an acquisition, you're going to hit that, and that has to go into the equation, and you have to really, you know, this is the toughest one probably to negotiate, frankly, but you have to, you know, and you can bring in references. It's almost like part of the selling process. You know, people that are your customers to say, yeah, like this is a solid relationship. This product, platform, service is solid. We're using it. You know, that says, okay, therefore, if we're going to hit that point in 2 years on a run rate perspective, then we want to be measured on a 5 times valuation of revenue or whatever model you can, you know, come up with that helps them feel like there is something there that they're going to add into the valuation equation. And then you have to negotiate, like, you have to really be tough on that point. But it has to have enough legs that, you know, and they'll give you some. They will give you some. They may not give you the multiple you're looking for, but the more credibility you have with customers you already signed, and the more reality there is in the pipeline of the customers that you are working with and you're going to sign, the higher the multiple they'll give you on the forward times revenue.
So in no particular order, here's some other best practices that we've gleaned from acting on the acquirer or the acquiree side. One of the things, as Dan says, for sure, that everybody's looking for is demonstration of traction. So don't just, you know, first of all, understand what traction means very well in your particular domain, which is sometimes debatable, and also demonstrate it. And so, for example, some of the data that was the most interesting to large companies in due diligence is, I was a little bit surprised, not anymore, but at the time when I first saw this, I was really surprised. They wanted really, really, really good information about what people who are using your products have to say, as much as possible, as much information, as many people. And so company A perhaps was relying on the fact that they had a great technology and they were brilliant technologically and they felt they had really the go-to-market strategy nailed. They didn't think they needed to bother with that information. Company B perhaps wasn't so strong in some of those domains, but they worked extremely hard to create situations where they were getting that kind of information, and also they were doing it in a way that it was validated. So they're using SurveyMonkey or whatever else the case may be, so you can show that it's not made up information. The valuation that the large company came up for target A and target B, they were very similar, they were competing targets, huge gap because of that. Because they were able to show, the target B was able to show that the product truly resonates with the user base. And that's so important to all these companies that we're talking about. But you have to show it. They have their own data. But part of the reason why they're looking at the acquisition is because there's a blind spot, perhaps. And I'm sure that was, Social Deck was a big part of that. There was something that came up that wasn't really in the plan of Google or Microsoft or Intel or whoever else. And they want to fill that gap. So they are purchasing the team, of course, but part of what they want as part of the team is deep insight into this area, but you know, it's not going to come from just talking in a boardroom. Yeah, it actually has to be validated. And so, if you're building a company and you don't have tools to, you know, create pilot situations and betas, and you're not actively mining the people who are participating for lots and lots of spontaneous feedback, then that's a major problem, because it's certainly valued extremely highly. The other one, of course, is branding. So a lot of, you know, there's some great companies with really terrible brands, and there's some not, you know, there's some very good companies with just wonderful brands. And I can't exaggerate the importance of a good brand, because one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is what generates traction. Why is it that some companies, you know, they have their advocates and people like them and they recommend them to other one and spontaneously and make introductions that help them do various things? And I think brand is a critical element to that. If you can't remember, or the brand, that's a problem. If the brand doesn't resonate for you, you're not going to live the brand. And you need thousands of people to literally live the brand of your company, to believe in it, to help you along, because you don't know where that introduction is going to come from. And so that's really the starting point. You know, so in the ecosystem, picking something that's actually available, there's good domain name availability, it doesn't infringe on someone else, it's not too descriptive, I think is pretty important. And companies do look at this. Of course, some of the acquirers are going to, you know, get rid of the brand the next day, but other ones, you know, they are looking for a brand that's going to continue to survive, whether it's as a mobile platform or web platform or whatever. And part of what they're buying is that accumulated goodwill through the use of the brand. So be very picky when you choose them.
I guess the only thing I'll also add on how do you, I mean, this is kind of common sense, so I apologize if it sounds so obvious, but it's sometimes harder to actually do, and that is when you're building your your pipeline of potential customers, and you're always thinking about those as also being potential acquirers. Trying to find the right, I call them like the Fantastic Four, right? And it's just a stupid name, but it's the four that you believe, first of all, that compete against each other in one way or another. But there is a fairly obvious amount of overlap between those four companies. And those four companies really become, a key milestone for you to actually get at least two of them as customers. Because once you start to move into that zone where you now have two of the four most obvious companies that will be interested in ultimately acquiring you, and they actually are competing, you're creating friction, right? You're creating a natural environment where they're going to ultimately learn about each other. And again, there's a very delicate dance you have to play on that too, to make sure that you're not shoving it in their face, and neither can you ever disclose, obviously, and you have to be very careful about how you go about it. But ultimately, they'll learn about each other, either because you have the rights to publicize it in PR, or you're at a conference or something. Like they suddenly realize, holy shit, you're doing business with them. And it's a magical moment, because sometimes what happens is you start to get this, it can backfire too, but again, it's not easy to pull off, but you can get to the point where one of them is really interested in buying you. And the other one just suddenly becomes much more interested when they find out that there's a potential that they're going to lose you as a source of product or service or platform. And so it becomes that proverbial, kind of defensive chess move for them to say, whether they think you're going to be acquired by that company and whether you really are or aren't, they better actually do something about it. But once you get to that certain point and you get a term sheet from one, you'll get a term sheet from the other one. And once you've got those two term sheets, then you could probably get a third one in actually at that point too. And then you've set yourself up nicely for a bidding war. So all that is a long way of saying, I've done that a couple of times. It's not easy to do, but it can pay off hugely. I mean, in the Social Deck case, we went from, well, I can't tell you the exact numbers, but I can tell you that we basically, by the end of the process, we doubled the value of what they were paying us. Just through that process of starting with one, getting another one really excited and pissed off that you were going to be taken out of the market. The other one gets to the table, and then you go and you get the third one that weren't even thinking about this, but suddenly now they don't want to be left out without this opportunity, and so now you have a third one at the table, and the obvious effect takes place of bidding up the price, and it's like a game, right? The corp dev people don't want to lose. They're highly measured on, once they've started down this path, they're incentivized and measured on how well they succeed in acquiring talent and technology and services that the company needs, and so they don't want to back away, and that's to your benefit.
The other thing that I've seen that work really, really well is companies that are responsive to what they're learning about the company who is looking at them as a target during the negotiation. So, they ask questions, they collect information, they see where the company's sweet spot is, perhaps in ways they didn't understand. They collect intelligence that perhaps the company actually wants the startup to integrate with the large company's platform in a very particular way. And if they're responsive and start generating some documentation that highlights how that would happen, one of the things that I've noticed is that the people who come on the deal team don't necessarily have any decision-making authority necessarily. So they're reporting to somebody else back at headquarters, obviously. And so if the company can help create the kind of documentation that builds the case for valuation and passes it on, it will get to the decision maker. Don't just rely on the sort of haphazard notes that are taken by somebody who may or may not be your advocate who's part of the deal team. Think about what you're learning about the company that's acquiring you and generate something that will help you. So we've seen that in a couple of deals, and it worked very nicely to sort of up the valuation a little bit. Dan, on some of these things, and sorry, there's a question in the back.
I was just going to say, can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
On that last point? So basically the way it worked was that on one of the deals, we had thought, well, the company especially had thought that they were being acquired for the talent, and really their software didn't really mean very much to the acquirer. That turned out actually not to be the case. Once the technical due diligence had been done, the large company realized that there was some value in the software. But of course, to get credit for that, it would be important to showcase the functionality, explain how it would integrate, to give a sense to the company, is this a big development project? Is it a small development project? Can it be done quickly? Is it going to take a very, very long time? Is lots of testing required? And the company had a very, very smart development team, and so they basically put together a document that explained exactly how their technology was going to integrate with the large company's platform. Built milestones around it, this whole project plan, basically. And they gave that document to the deal team. We're speculating a little bit, but my guess is that the document went to whoever was making the decision, because all of a sudden the valuation went up significantly because the company was impressed by the technical capabilities of the team. So in their eyes, the value of this team went up. There are other competitive considerations too, but in other cases, it's quite easy to imagine that a company wouldn't pick up on that and wouldn't really take the extra effort to do that. They probably had to stay up all night to create that document, but it gained them several millions of extra dollars, arguably. So I think that's an example of the kinds of things that you have to be listening in these negotiations and reacting.
Yeah, and I think you had mentioned this earlier too, and it's something that it was this absolutely true story that, and it goes back to research that I'm sure MaRS can help out a lot with, is that knowing what's going on in your market from an acquisition valuation perspective in companies that are like you, and there's all various ways to slice and dice companies that are like you, but like you in size, in financial scenario, from a market, where you are in your business stage, and of course how hot the specific market you're in is. But having research data about that from an acquisition valuation perspective, and getting really good synopsis of what those various companies were acquired at, and therefore what the valuation, you can kind of reverse engineer the valuation models, is very helpful. Like especially when you're at the very last stage of a negotiation and you're trying to get that last few million or tens of million, or for some of you hundreds of millions. But when you have data and research can substantiate the valuation that you're looking for, it can make a huge difference, and it did in one of my acquisitions for sure. We were able to hire an outside, because there wasn't a MaRS at that time, and we had to hire an outside firm to go do this. And they came to the table and threw down this analysis that we had to be valued at that time an 8 times multiple, and at the end of the day we got it. Because the data was there, we weren't just coming up with a number that, and that the decision makers, I think, also felt more comfortable that they could take it forward to their CEO and say, look, the data here substantiates this valuation. So everybody was able to kind of, get their heads around the final number.
So who can people go to? Because some companies have got great teams and they have these resources internally, but most are lacking, one piece or another.
Well, MaRS is tracking a lot of valuation data.
I mean, the actual exercise isn't complicated. It's getting the data.
Yeah.
So the fundamentals of evaluation analysis are pretty.
Well,
So, yeah.
this is the case where it may be, if you can afford it, to actually get an investment banker. Well, or someone that an investment banker who has who has a lot of and tracks a lot of data, because they get involved in M&A, and there's some good ones out there that do.
If I can make a quick comment, probably 90% of what you said is as relevant and as important as you're raising venture financing
Right.
from institutional investors. Be prepared, get your brand, know your competitors, understand your business model. Always assume anywhere you go, in any interaction you have, that you're being measured and evaluated, because that's 100% true.
The investment banker is also useful at the point that you do have 1 or 2 offers on the table, and at that point it's perfectly okay for the investment banker to kind of cold call some people and say, so-and-so is there's something on the table.
Yeah.
You want to be a part of that.
And that's right.
And at that point, it's not, you know, it's totally appropriate for them to be doing that. And certainly, the other thing about investment bankers is, even if you're not going to use them, it's very useful to pick their brains and, you know, just talk to a few, and you'll learn a lot of what, you know, we certainly didn't know much going into this, and in general, you're dealing with people that are doing this all day. Whether you're getting financing, whether you're getting acquired, that's all they're doing, and you're a startup, and you probably never did this before, and you're at a huge disadvantage. So the more people that you can talk to that have been through this before, the more you can help yourself. It's just kind of common sense, and it's totally true.
Yeah. But be very careful about confidentiality. You can talk to people, but when you know, a Google or Microsoft, whoever says that the negotiations are confidential, they really, really, really mean it.
Oh yeah, it's a deal killer.
It's not only a deal blower. You may find that you have other issues. Let's just say that. So it's because I think there tends to be a view sometimes that some of these things are loose, and it's okay to consult, but you're going to have to keep things very hypothetical in getting your insight. There's a question in the back. I'll take that one first, please.
Yeah, I'm just listening to your comment about sort of the Fantastic Four, and I think that's something that's overlooked, and I think it's very important. When companies are in their formative stages, their early stages, you know, one of the things that we talk about with the people that we work with is, you know, take your management team and divide them up, and each quarter, the management team is responsible for a certain number of companies in their sector, competitors, suppliers, that sort of thing, to keep track of contracts, people they're hiring, what they're doing, that sort of thing. So if you got a call from a Google, you're in a position to respond quickly by bringing your team together and say, okay, these are the 5 companies that we should be contacting to bring them into the fray immediately, as opposed to sitting down at that point and saying, you know, why should we go to a VC company? Does it make sense to talk to them?
Yeah.
I think that's, you know, the earlier in the planning you get, much better.
Strategic planning. Yeah.
Yeah, just a question on confidentiality versus getting your bidders to compete against you, or getting a second or third bidder. How would you do that if everything needs to be confidential?
Very carefully. Very carefully. I mean, it's a timing thing. Once you actually get an LOI and you sign back the LOI, it's too late, basically. That's my opinion, okay? And probably would be a lawyer's opinion. But if you know that LOI is coming, and again, you have to be so careful how you do this, right? Because it's a loyalty, it's a trust question, it's a, you know, ethics question. And so, you know, this is why I don't think it can't be a last-minute thing. Like, if you have your Fantastic Four and you have established relationships, and you may or may not already have business flowing, commercial business flowing between you, you may have some and not others, that's okay, but those Fantastic Four are the ones that the first ones you're gonna call. And, or maybe not even you, by the way. It would be better that someone else calls them and says, you know, hey, I think there might be something in motion here. You know this company, right? Oh yeah, we know this company, we love these guys. Great, well you may want to stick your head in to find out what's the latest and be interested in something more strategic. This would be a good time. So it's a delicate dance. Like, it's not, there's no secret kind of easy way to do it. You have to be very careful about how you go about it, because you don't want to piss off, you know, the person that's about to give you an LOI either. You want that LOI to come in, but then you want others to be ready to pounce. And you know, typically what happens in the LOI, and Anthony, you should probably speak better to this, but you have a period of time in which, you know, to sign back. And so before you do that, you know, you meet with your board, you have to go through a governance process, and that's a period in which, if you're well prepared for that time coming, that's the period in which you're now trying to get others to the table. And then it becomes a negotiation, and you have to push out the irrevocable date and work hard to, you know, get yourself enough time that you have multiple bidders at the table. And then at some point you have to disclose that. Like, you can't, in my opinion, again, you can't just keep going on as if there isn't. You have to say to, you know, acquire A, while we are looking at this, we now have another interested party. You know, it's a very hard message to deliver, and again, you have to do it the right way. But And the corp dev person on the other end just, I knew this was going to happen, but they usually react with a more competitive nature with, okay, they'll try to get information out of you about it. You can't tell them, and you have to play the game, and you have to play it, very carefully, and with a lot of good, strong advice from, your legal team and your board and just your trusted advisors, basically, as you're going through it.
Every situation is different, so oftentimes the LOI is preceded by a non-disclosure agreement, even before you get the LOI, and other times it's not. Non-disclosure agreements are not the same document every time. You really have to read them to understand what you're restricted from doing. Same thing from the LOIs. So we've seen a real range. Some of them, for example, will say that you can't disclose whom you're negotiating with, and they're very specific as to what you can't disclose to other parties. So they're meant to allow you to work with outside parties, to get feedback from your ecosystem, and other ones, they only name the specific advisors that you're allowed to speak to, for example. So there's a broad range. The other thing, of course, is that if the agreement is silent, but the negotiations are supposed to be confidential, that doesn't necessarily, in my view, mean that you can't even disclose to someone else the very fact that discussions are happening, right? So when we draft those agreements and we want to make sure that the person is not negotiating with anyone else, usually we ask for an exclusivity period, right, which you see relatively often, or we're very explicit that we don't want them discussing even the fact that discussions are occurring regarding acquisition. So there's lots of different flavors.
But that's after the LOI is signed.
Well, it depends. Usually yes, but it really depends. So there's lots of, I would say that people at MaRS, for example, they have a lot of experience in these deals actually. So you can get a lot of advice from your advisors, but also even from people who are here at MaRS who've done deals.
So many times the founders will join the acquirer. How do you balance negotiating well and tough and the next day being an employee of that company and having a good working relationship going forward?
For those of you who've been through it, I'm sure you understand this. You basically get to a certain point when you're close to the close of the actual definitive agreement to be acquired, the reorganization, or I guess there's different terms, but where you have to resign from your current company, at midnight, the day the deal is closing, and just prior to that, you've got an offer with the new company, and that in itself is another parallel process that you have to go through, because now in adjacent to making sure you've got everything done to make sure that deal closes. This is long after the term sheet's been signed and you've worked through the definitives, and now in parallel you're negotiating for all the employees. So as CEO or COO or founder, you are looking out for the best interests of everyone in a post-acquisition, and so every case, you have to make sure that employee, or in the case of being a founder, that it is what you want. Now the weird thing about this, it's a bit of a strange timing cycle, because you've gotten so far, and this is of course all, I'm sure it's all been by design, you get so far down the path that the last thing you really start thinking about, you're just so happy that the company's going to be acquired and that you're going to make some money, and yeah, okay, you're going to work for the new company, and all of a sudden then at the very last kind of end of this process, you're hit with here's what your new job's going to be, here's your compensation, here's
your non-compete.
Here's your non-compete, non-solicit, non-this, non-that, everything like locked up, basically. A lockup for 2, 3, 4 years in some cases. And then that, it kind of jolts you and you're like, holy crap. Like, I didn't think it was going to be this onerous in terms of, I thought I might be able to kind of sneak away and, escape. And so be prepared for that. And in fact, I would again say, forward think and ask a ton of questions even earlier on in the cycle to make sure you're meeting the people that you'll end up working with. Mm-hmm. And they don't always get involved in this process on purpose. They keep them away. And so you want to make sure that you are getting insight to where you're going to, what part of the organization they want you to be in, what the mission and mandate of your team will be. Will the team still be together? What's your specific role? You got to ask all those questions as early on as you possibly can, once you've gone beyond the term sheet. Like I wouldn't worry about that, until you get the term sheet. But between the term sheet and the close of the actual definitives, don't wait too long to get into that, because give yourself more time to basically negotiate that it is a role that you really are going to be excited about, that you've met the people and you do like them, and you can see yourself fitting in working with them. Which of course I guess would be bad if you figured out you hated them. Then what do you do? But and that you understand the lockup, and that you're really mentally committed to that lockup period, and going to be able to live through it, and come out the other end better for it, whether it's just because they've offered you a great job with a great learning experience, plus more wealth creation in assets or stock or shares or RSUs or whatever it is that they're going to offer.
That's a really good insight, because I've seen a deal where it basically because it closed down completely because of one of the founders didn't think that the non-compete was for a reasonable period of time. And from an acquirer perspective, they'll back away from the whole deal. That's not the point in which to negotiate. It's not a negotiable item from their perspective. So as Dan says, try to find out what their policy is, because you're right. Sometimes I have seen 4 years. Now that's debatable whether that's enforceable, but probably it is, depending on the jurisdiction. But you do see 2, 3, 4 all the time. And also when you're a group of people, you have to make sure that while there's one person who's a lead negotiator who's good at getting the deal and so on, make sure that the rest of the people are fully involved in the negotiation, abreast of every step, because that's also an area where things typically fall apart. So in the case that I'm thinking of, basically that's what happened, that one of the founders, it was the first he had heard of a 3-year non-compete period. I don't know what he was thinking in his mind was going to be the non-compete period. I think it was 6 months, he thought. And he made some statements, and the acquirer just said there are some other issues as well, but they walked away. So I think it's very important to ask those questions early on.
Sorry, did I answer your question?
Sort of. The other question where I was trying to go with this was, but you had some great points, was when do you use the lead negotiator versus someone in the middle, an intermediary, so that you do preserve that relationship when people do transfer over? How do you balance that, and when's the right time to do that? And, who plays hardball in that period?
Yeah, I would, my personal opinion and advice would be the founders who are usually the key talent that the acquirer want most. Mm-hmm. They should not be in the firing line. They should be right behind the lead negotiators. And the lead negotiator, in my opinion, should be someone that understands that's very close to the founders. It's hard to be a lead negotiator if you're from the outside, in my experience. Mm-hmm. If you're not tight with the founders and really understand the business. It's very difficult to do, and you're not going to be as optimal in the process. But if you are a member of the board and are close with the founders, or an advisor that is close, meaning an advisor to the company, because you really understand what the business is all about. And again, it's all about having a very strong relationship with the founders, so that you're speaking for them. You're knowledgeable as to what their desires are, and you can take all the heat and you can play tough and afford to potentially damage. You have to be, the lead negotiator has to be a person that can potentially afford to damage the relationship with the negotiator on the other side. Not to screw the deal, but just to basically fight. To fight absolutely, so there's not a penny left on the table. And in the process, they may hate you. And therefore, that's why it's probably good to not be an employee of the company being acquired. But you have to kind of.
And it's tough, because I think the lead negotiator finds themselves in a position where they're advocating for the acquirer relative to the rest of the founding team, especially. But sometimes you need to play that role, especially where the acquirer is asking for something that's reasonable, because sometimes it's interesting the things that people focus on in the negotiation process, what it is they don't want to give the acquirer. But then the lead negotiator has to ensure that they know what's reasonable in the circumstances, because there are typical reasonable asks from acquirers, whether it's on the due diligence side, or it's on the non-compete or the non-solicit side. And so, you know, if they're asking for something that's reasonable and you're pushing back, that's when they're going to get really, really mad. So, you know, you're going to have to find that out, and you're going to have to be very diplomatic in negotiating with the rest of the group.
There's also lots of negotiation tactics that, you know, I'm sure we've all read books on negotiation tactics, and there's some good ones to use for sure. Because you don't always want to be the only lead negotiator right to the very end of the deal. You want to be there, you know, far enough down the line that when you know there's that last bid on the table, that you've kind of probably outlived your ability to get, then you sweep in another tough negotiator to get that last bit. And that's usually a better tactic.
Are there any other questions?
What are the three key things that acquirers are looking for? Like you mentioned, like team, product, potentially. Why are they acquiring companies at this point in time? Like getting bigger market share or new talent? What are the top three?
I think it depends on the company. Every company has a very different set of reasons. It's more a different prioritization of their reasons, in my view. So there's certain companies like Cisco. They want to acquire a ready-to-go product with revenue proven, validated, tested, plug it into their offerings. IBM wants new business units, basically. So unfortunately, there isn't sort of a list. You really have to modify it depending on the specific company we're talking about.
Yeah, I would agree. Team, assets meaning IP, and if you have decent revenue and earnings, it can be accretive, and it depends again on what stage you are relevant to what stage the acquirer is at. If it's accretive, then you know that's important to them too.
So on a couple of housekeeping notes, MaRS is going to make the presentation available with the slides. And so there are a number of slides that I created on best practices around IP that I didn't really want to take away from the discussion that we had for a number of reasons, because I think people are used to having some of these things presented to them. Although there's some interesting case studies, IP strategy based on essentially Facebook, which is an interesting way to look at how to build a really strong IP strategy. And it's really all about, slides are about small companies acting as though they're large companies by following very, very important best practices around IP. So I encourage you just to get a copy of the presentation, and if you have questions, obviously you'll find a way to reach us. But there's some interesting things for you to ponder on from a purely IP perspective. Just on the IP aspect, sometimes it's really important, and sometimes people don't care one bit. The problem is you don't know who's going to acquire you, you don't know who's going to sue you, you don't know who you're going to have to sue. So you have to do the best you can to have compelling intellectual property. So most people do something about it. The problem is if you have the right strategy, I think you can get more value out of it. So keep that in mind. And then the one case study that I think is relatively public, so I can talk about it, and I'll leave you on that note, but it's a tremendous outlier, is BumpTop. How many people have heard of BumpTop? Okay, so BumpTop is interesting. So let me give you, this is all information that I found publicly available at other sources, so I could share it. But basically what it boiled down to is BumpTop had a very interesting technology, amazing team, and they had an idea, actually a collection of ideas. They thought it would be interesting to have a much better desktop, for example, in Windows. So rather than these two-dimensional folders that you just have to arrange in the same arrangement, what if you could throw them around and they had momentum and you could stack them and you could have a desk in there and so on and so forth. It was an interesting idea, and they had a series of algorithms for feeding that functionality. So there was an engine based on those algorithms. But what we realized is that we could probably build a high-level metaphor. So we were going to go for platform technology rather than just the features. So we weren't sure whether the claims were going to go through, but we were very aggressive in the way we drafted the application. We did get the claims through. So in effect, BumpTop had claims saying, essentially, if you have a system that has this engine that feeds this kind of physical attributes to objects in an interface, you fall within their claim. As it turns out, Google was thinking of having that kind of functionality in Chrome. But more importantly, they heard that Microsoft was thinking of introducing that in their next release of Windows. In fact, apparently they had put that functionality in the next release of Windows. So for many other reasons, the team being obviously the big one, Google bought BumpTop, but it was very nice to have that patent because soon afterwards, Google sent a letter to Microsoft, and I'm sure there are other reasons, including bugs, to delay the release, but they had to take that functionality apparently out of the release of Windows because of that patent. So that was an interesting bonus, obviously, to Google to cause some grief for their competitor. So it's a bit of an outlier. However, the example that it shows is that BumpTop was going to file a patent anyways. What was different was that the realization that there was this bigger target, possibly. Hard to see what value it would have, but as it turns out, serendipity came into play, and it ended up being very, very important. So you can get those slides, and there'll be some useful information for you in them.
Just a note, when you'll get an email in a couple days, and we'll have a link to the slides, because I'm sure you're keen to see all that Anthony just created. And I just wanted to thank Dan and Anthony for a really fantastic presentation on a subject that it's really hard to get access to information about. It's really a real-life